Today I'm going to show you the family tree of Roman emperors. I'll be starting with the first Roman emperor, Augustus, and going all the way down to the 6th century emperor, Justinian the Great. I'll be using my Roman emperors family tree chart, which is available as a poster from my website, usefulcharts.com. The first thing I want to point out is that unlike later European monarchies, there's not actually an unbroken bloodline between all of these emperors. However, there were several dynasties at various points, and these are represented by the various colors on the chart. I'm going to start up at the top with the first dynasty, which is the Julio-Claudian dynasty. And in fact, instead of starting with Augustus, I'm going to start with his very famous great uncle, Julius Caesar. Before Rome became an empire, it was a republic governed by a senate. But in the last days of the republic, there were 3 generals who came to dominate things, and informally they were called the First Triumvirate. These 3 men were Julius Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus. After Crassus died, there was a power struggle between Pompey and Caesar Caesar ended up winning and was named the dictator of the Roman Republic. Eventually, however, the Senate started to worry that Caesar was becoming too popular and might end up being proclaimed king. They therefore quite famously had him assassinated. The 2 main people behind the plot are actually shown on this chart as well. Brutus was the son of Caesar's mistress, Servilia, and Cassius was the son-in-law of that same mistress, although through a different relationship. So after Caesar was assassinated, power was shared by a second triumvirate, consisting of Mark Antony, previously a close ally of Julius Caesar, Octavian, who later becomes Augustus. He was the grandson of Caesar's sister Julia, and Caesar actually ended up adopting him as his own son. And finally, Lepidus, who was another son-in-law of Caesar's mistress Servilia. Eventually, though, Octavian and Mark Antony became enemies. Part of the reason was that Mark Antony was originally married to Octavian's sister, but then started a relationship with Cleopatra, the pharaoh of Egypt. Earlier, Cleopatra had had a relationship with Julius Caesar and produced a son by him named Caesarion. There was a fear that this son might end up becoming the ruler of Rome, so Octavian fought against Mark Antony, and eventually he won at the famous Battle of Actium. After that, Octavian became known as Augustus, and he is generally considered to have been the first emperor of Rome. If we look to the side here, you can see some of the titles used by the emperors of Rome. Initially, the emperors were not technically monarchs. Instead, they held the title Princeps Civitatis, which meant first citizen or first among equals. In reality, though, they held as much power as a monarch would, if not more. But because of this title, the period we are about to look at is called the Principate. Now, Augustus did not have any sons, but he did have a daughter, and that daughter married the famous general Marcus Agrippa. And these 2 did have sons who were meant to become the heirs of Augustus. But they died young, and so Augustus named his 2 stepsons, Tiberius and Drusus, as his heirs. Tiberius and Drusus were the sons of his wife Livia through her first husband Claudius, and this is why the dynasty is called Julio-Claudian. Julio for the connection to Julius Caesar, and Claudian for this link to Claudius. Drusus was actually the favorite of Augustus, but he died before Augustus, so when Augustus died, Tiberius was the only remaining heir, so he became the second emperor. Now, part of the agreement was that Tiberius would adopt Germanicus, son of Drusus. Hence, the line would eventually go through Drusus after all. Germanicus was meant to be the 3rd emperor, but he died before Tiberius, and therefore his son Caligula became the next emperor. Caligula had a short reign and was assassinated, so the emperorship then went to the brother of Germanicus named Claudius. Claudius then adopted as his heir Nero, the grandson of Germanicus, and therefore Nero became the fifth and final emperor of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. So you can see that all these early emperors were all connected through some sort of adoption, but also through some sort of blood relationship to either the Julian or the Claudian family. Now, Nero was quite famously thought to be involved in the Great Fire of Rome. He went mad in his later years and actually ended up committing suicide. So after his death, there was a power struggle. The year 69 is known as the Year of the Four Emperors, in which 4 different military leaders were proclaimed emperor. Eventually, Vespasian won out and became emperor for the next 10 years. He is the start of a new but rather short dynasty known as the Flavian dynasty. After he died, he was followed by his 2 sons, Titus and Domitian. Domitian ended up being assassinated, after which his advisor Nerva was proclaimed emperor. So with Nerva, we get the 3rd dynasty, sometimes called the Nerva-Antonine dynasty. Nerva was elderly at the time, so he did not actually rule long, but he had adopted as his heir an individual named Trajan. So Trajan soon became the next emperor. It was during the rule of Trajan that Rome reached its peak of power. You can see that at this point, the emperorship is once again passed on through adoption on a regular basis, just like it was during the Julio-Claudian dynasty. But interestingly, there was also often a genealogical connection as well. For example, Trajan chose as his heir Hadrian. Both Trajan and Hadrian were descendants of this individual here. They were also connected through Hadrian's wife as well. Anyway, if we continue forward, we see that Hadrian adopted Antoninus Pius, who was his wife's sister's daughter's husband, and Antoninus Pius adopted 2 individuals who would become joint emperors after him, Lucius Verus and Marcus Aurelius. Lucius Verus was married to Marcus Aurelius's daughter, and Marcus Aurelius was married to Antoninus Pius's daughter. Lucius Verus did not rule as long as Marcus Aurelius, so Marcus Aurelius is usually remembered as the main emperor for that period. If we take him and the previous emperors back to Nerva, we get 5 emperors. These men are collectively known as the 5 good emperors, because during this time, Rome was at its peak and things were fairly peaceful. This came to an end when Marcus Aurelius chose his son Commodus as his heir instead of adopting someone. This is famously played out in the Russell Crowe movie Gladiator, albeit with much creative license. With Commodus, Rome started a slow climb downhill. Commodus eventually was assassinated, and then we get the year of the 5 emperors. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different individuals were proclaimed emperor in the year 193. But eventually, this individual, Severus, wins out and becomes sole emperor. He established the Severan dynasty, and during his time as emperor, he ruled partially with his 2 sons, Geta and Caracalla. After Severus died, Caracalla assassinated his brother, but then himself was assassinated. And then we get a non-dynastic emperor for a year or so. We then get some more distant relatives of Severus as emperors, Elagabalus and Alexander Severus. They were the grandchildren of this Julia, who was the sister of this Julia, who was the wife of Severus. Now, the interesting thing about these 4 emperors is that they can all trace their roots to an individual named Julius Bassianus, who was a high priest in Syria. And that individual, through an unknown number of generations, is thought to have been a descendant of this priest king, also in Syria. And that priest king was a direct descendant of Cleopatra and Mark Antony. So we have at least 4 emperors who may have been descendants of both Cleopatra and Mark Antony. Okay, after the death of Alexander Severus, we get a period known as the Crisis of the 3rd century. This is a time when, within about 50 years, we get at least 25 different emperors. It's hard to get an exact count because some of them named their sons as joint rulers, but there was about 25 different emperors in a 50-year period. In fact, the year 238 is known as the year of, this time, 6 emperors. So it was a time of great instability in the empire, and there were even a few breakaway states for a while. Those were brought back into the fold by an emperor named Aurelian. However, things didn't really stabilize until we arrive at Diocletian. A few years into his rule, he decided to solve the problem by splitting the empire in 2. He retained the title of emperor in the east, and then he named another individual, Maximian, as emperor of the west. This system was known as the Tetrarchy. Tetrarchy means rule by 4, and the reason for this is that each of the 2 senior emperors also had a junior emperor called a Caesar working under them. So in effect, there was always 4 rulers of the empire at any given time. This is why I've restarted the numbers at this point. The blue numbers represent the emperors in the east, and the green numbers represent the emperors in the west. I've also restarted the numbers because now we move into a period known as the Dominate, which can be contrasted with the earlier Principate. Starting with Diocletian, the emperors also held the title of Dominus, or Lord, meaning that everyone now admitted that Rome was no longer a republic. Anyway, you can see that there's some loose family connections between the emperors of this period, but mostly they were just chosen by appointment. The Tetrarchy system worked for a few decades up until an emperor named Constantine the Great. He defeated the other emperor and became the first person since Diocletian to rule both the east and the west at the same time. He was also the first Roman emperor to convert to Christianity, and he was the emperor who moved the capital from Rome to Byzantium, renaming it Constantinople. His father was an emperor before him, and 3 of his sons went on to become emperors. So altogether, they can be considered the Constantinian dynasty. After that dynasty, there was a general named Jovian who was declared emperor, and then another general who became Emperor Valentinian the Great. He, his brother, and his 2 sons are considered to be a dynasty, but soon after the death of Valentinian I, we get the start of another new dynasty, the Theodosian dynasty. That dynasty started with Valentinian the Great's son-in-law, Theodosius, who became Theodosius the Great. Theodosius ended up ruling both halves of the empire, and in fact was the last person to do so. When he died in 395, the empire became permanently divided, with his son Honorius ruling the west and Arcadius ruling the east. Let's look at the west first. Both Honorius and his nephew Valentinian III had fairly long reigns. But during this time, the Western Empire started to be taken over by various Germanic tribes. In fact, in the year 410, the city of Rome was sacked for the first time in 800 years. In the final decades of the Western Empire, we get a bunch of different people taking on the role of emperor. The final emperor in the West is usually considered to be either Julius Nepos or Romulus Augustus. Finally, in 476, the West falls for good, with a barbarian leader named Odoacer becoming king. In the East, we get a totally different story. There, things continued for another 1,000 years after the fall of the Western Empire. However, the empire in the East during that period is often referred to as the Byzantine Empire rather than the Roman Empire. But in the eyes of the people at the time, it was simply the same old Roman Empire that had been started by Augustus. So let's look at a few more emperors in the East. I'm not going to cover them all because they are actually continued on another chart, and I'll tell you about that in a moment. So after Arcadius, we get his son Theodosius II, and then his son-in-law Marcian. You can see here that Marcian had a daughter who married one of the final emperors in the West. In fact, they then had a son who married the daughter of the emperor who established the next dynasty in the East, the Leonid dynasty. That was Emperor Leo I. He was followed by two son-in-laws, a grandson, and a brother-in-law. It was during the Leonid dynasty in the East that the fall of the Western Empire occurred. So once the West fell, the Eastern emperors were once again the sole emperors, and they definitely saw themselves as such. After the Leonid dynasty, we get the Justinian dynasty, most notable because it included the last really powerful Roman emperor, Justinian the Great. Justinian is important for many reasons, but one of them is that he managed to take back the city of Rome, which was at that time controlled by the Ostrogoths. The Byzantines then went on to retain control of Rome until the time of Charlemagne. And this is where this particular chart comes to an end. Not long after Justinian, the Byzantine emperors switched from using Latin to using Greek. If you want to see the rest of the family tree of Byzantine emperors, you can pick up the story using my European royal family tree, North and East edition. There, the tree starts with Basil I of the Macedonian dynasty and goes down to Constantine XI Palaiologos. If you're interested in how things continued in Western Europe, you'll want to use my European Royal Family Tree West edition. That chart starts with Charlemagne and goes on to cover the monarchies of Spain, France, England, Germany, and so forth. Both of these charts, as well as the one we've looked at today, are available from my website, usefulcharts.com.